So, this video will be slightly different from most other videos, since it won't deal with any specific country or region. Instead, I decided to do a standalone video explaining some of the basic demographics related terminology I commonly use in my videos. I have already explained most of these terms in my various videos in one way or another. Nevertheless, I still often see people commenting under my videos, people who approach me via email to discuss something that caught their attention, or just people I discuss these issues with in real life, saying stuff that indicates that maybe some of these terms may still be not correctly or entirely understood by many. Now, I do not want to sound like a jerk. That is by no means meant to say, oh my god, I have explained this so many times and people still do not get it. It is entirely understandable. Many people might not watch all my videos, but only some of them that caught their attention. Many people might have just forgotten, since everybody has a lot going on in their lives, and they cannot remember every technical term that I am blabbering about. And an equally plausible explanation is that I have just not explained it very well. So, I thought it might be a good idea to do a standalone video where I explain them all in one place. And of course, I will try to make this video as engaging and practical as possible by using a number of real-life examples from various countries around the globe to showcase the meaning of the terms, since the worst thing that can happen is for demographics to be just perceived as some dry statistical field full of boring technical terms. It is not. While these terms might seem technical and dry at first sight, they all describe the real-life behavior of people on a populational level. Behind every one of these terms is a country, culture, or ethnic group rising and getting stronger, or declining and slowly withering away. So, let's get to it. Let's start with the basics. What is the best way to measure the reproductive behavior of any given population we are interested in? Be it a country, ethnic or religious group, social class, or any other statistically relevant population. The first thing that comes to mind is the number of live births. But that has its issues. You need to have a lot of context to distill more specific information about the reproductive behavior of the given population. So, in 2018, there were over 15 million live births in China, the most populous country on the planet at the time. Now, is 15 million a lot? Is it a few? Compared to what? You can pretty much only compare China to India, or China in earlier periods. So you can find out that the number of births in China has declined quite a lot compared to the 1960s. But what if they were just really high in the 1960s and now they declined to a completely sustainable level? What even is the sustainable level? Sure, if you see there are more deaths than births, then you know it is not sustainable. But that was not the case in China until the last 2 years. You can find out that the number of births in India, the only comparable country to China, was higher, about 24 million. But what if the number of births in India is just supermassively large? Based on the number of births, it is hard to make these conclusions. That is why the most commonly used metric by myself, as well as by most people writing about the topic, is the total fertility rate, often used by the acronym TFR. That is the measurement used in the vast majority of cases when you read or hear someone talking about the fact that in some country there is some number of children per woman. Now, the definition of total fertility rate is the average number of children that are born to a woman over her lifetime, if they were to experience the exact current age-specific fertility rates through their lifetime, and they were to live from birth until the end of their reproductive life. Now, what does that mean? Basically, you take the number of children born to women of reproductive age in the current year, and you create a sort of statistical fiction. Suppose the reproductive behavior of women of childbearing age would stay exactly the same for the rest of their reproductive period as in the current year. And suppose all of those women will survive to the end of their reproductive period. The number of children per one woman in the reproductive age will be 1.5, 2.3, 3.4, or whatever. It is obviously an arithmetic mean. Nobody actually has 0.3 children. Well, we wanted to have a child, but the economy is really bad now, so we decided to just have a third of it. It eats less, but getting the clothes is a pain in the ass. So, if South Korean women of reproductive age would have the same amount of children for the rest of their reproductive age as in 2023, and none of them would die in the meantime, they would have 0.7 children per woman. Hence, the South Korean fertility rate for 2023. Now, there is also another metric called the completed cohort fertility, which measures the real fertility rates of cohorts of women that have already completed their childbearing age. This metric is not a statistical fiction of the sort that total fertility rate is. It is just an arithmetic mean of the actual fertility rates. The downside is that you can only use this statistic retrospectively for age cohorts that have already finished their childbearing years. Since the childbearing years are usually defined as up to 49 years of age, you can now use this metric for women born in the early 1970s. It is thus not really useful for determining the current trends, only for measuring past fertility. Now, what are the upsides of the total fertility rate? I would say that the whole lot of it has to do with the fact that it is easily imaginable. We all have some ingrained idea of what an average family looks like. Now, these ideas obviously differ depending on where one is from, but the vast majority of my viewers are from Euro-American space, and the average family size, in most cases, is somewhere around 2 children per mother. Now, the average number of children per mother is a whole other statistic, since it excludes all the childless people who significantly push down the overall fertility rate. However, since our mothers were obviously not childless, our perception of average family size is molded mostly by this number. Most of my viewers likely have one sibling. Smaller portions have either none or 2, and a small minority have 3 or more siblings. So, when you read that women in South Korea have 0.7 children per woman, you likely instinctively say to yourself, damn, that is a hell of a low number. Less than 1 child per woman. Or you see that total fertility rate in Niger is 6.5, and you instinctively understand that it is a pretty damn lot. The concept is instinctively understandable in relation to real life, which is useful when explaining things. Another upside is that the replacement rate is calculated based on the total fertility rate, the well-known magical threshold of 2.1 children per woman. Generally, if a country has a lower fertility rate than 2.1, it is going to naturally decline, and its median age is going to increase. Suppose there is no immigration or emigration. It is thus a very powerful tool for relatively easily comprehending the current reproductive behavior of society in one number. But even that is not as straightforward as it might seem. Now, the reason why the replacement rate is 2.1 and not 2, which would be logical since if 2 parents have 2 children, the population stays the same, is mortality rates. In every society, a certain number of people just do not survive until the end of their childbearing years. To balance this, a surplus of 0.1 children is needed. However, since mortality rates differ quite dramatically in the different areas of the world, it is generally estimated that in many developed, wealthy countries, the replacement rate might actually be even lower than 2.1, somewhere between 2 and 2.1. In contrast, the replacement rate might be as high as 2.3 in some of the poorest countries on the planet, for example in Africa, due to the increased mortality in youth caused by lack of healthcare, diseases, famine, military conflict, or such. To make things a little bit more complicated, there is also the so-called net reproduction rate. It is very similar to the total fertility rate, but it only considers daughters and pays heed to mortality rates. The replacement rate calculated in net reproduction rate stands at 1. If the reproduction rate is lower than 1, the population declines. If it is higher, it grows. This metric is useful especially for countries with some form of cultural preference for having sons, such as East Asian countries. Their net reproduction rate is even lower than their total fertility rate, because there is a culturally ingrained male surplus among the newborns. So, to tie in with the example used at the beginning of this chapter, you can now look at Chinese fertility rate in 2018 and you know that it was 1.5. Therefore, you can conclude that if the Chinese fertility rate stays at that level, the Chinese population will decline sooner or later, depending on the age structure, which I will cover later. The Indian fertility rate in 2018 was 2.18, and we can thus conclude that if the fertility stayed that way, the Indian population would, after some time, stabilize and either stay more or less the same or grew very modestly, depending on the mortality rates. The big advantage of the total fertility rate is that it takes into account only women of childbearing age, and subsequently, it is not skewed by the age structure of the population. I say that since I often see people claiming that the fertility rate in some regions or some countries is so low because the population there is very old and there are very few young people. That is incorrect, since only the women of reproductive age are taken into account when fertility is calculated. It is nevertheless important to keep in mind that the total fertility rate considers only women of childbearing age. That means that sometimes seemingly contradictory stuff might happen. The fertility rate can increase, even though the number of births decreases. That happens when the number of women of childbearing age rapidly decreases due to large cohorts of women aging out of this category. If the births decline proportionally less than the number of women of childbearing age, the fertility rate increases. The reasons I outlined above are why I think it is better to use the total fertility rate for showcasing things rather than the second most commonly used way of measuring birth rates, the crude birth rate. Crude birth rate measures the number of births per 1,000 people in a given population, plain and simple. In terms of measuring the number of children some population produces, it is the most accurate dataset. But firstly, the crude birth rate does not possess the instinctive graspability of the total fertility rate. If you see that Brazil has a crude birth rate of 13, so 13 live births per 1,000 people, it does not tell you much if you do not possess a lot of other context. Is that low? Is that high? Compared to what? It also does not have any clearly set boundaries showing the replacement rate, like in the case of total fertility rate. But generally, if the crude birth rate is lower than 15 live births per 1,000 people, the fertility is usually subreplacement. But it depends a lot on the age structure. Suppose your population age structure is relatively young, and you thus have a relatively higher share of the population in reproductive age. In that case, you can produce more children per 1,000 people than a country with significantly higher median age, even if your total fertility rate is the same or even lower. There are plenty of examples of this phenomenon, usually with countries that have relatively recently undergone a rapid decline in their fertility rate, which have not yet managed to alter their age structure significantly. In 2023, the crude birth rate was almost identical in Chile and in Bulgaria, with close to 9 live births per 1,000 people, even though the fertility rate in Bulgaria was 1.8 children per woman and the fertility rate in Chile was 1.2. Another example might be the comparison of Tunisia and Serbia, which had almost identical fertility rates in 2023, with 1.57 in Tunisia versus 1.61 in Serbia. However, the crude birth rate was significantly higher in Tunisia than in Serbia, 12.4 versus 9.2. In both cases, you have countries with relatively young population structures that have undergone rapid fertility decline in recent years, versus countries that have been demographically hemorrhaged by decades of low fertility and emigration. Now, the examples of Serbia and Bulgaria are also interesting in other way, and that is because they show the importance of keeping accurate censuses of the population to accurately calculate the total fertility rate. In some of the Eastern European countries that suffer from significant emigration, there is a phenomenon that happens when the country does a census, finds out its population is much lower than estimated due to emigration, and its fertility rates shoot up significantly year on year. Not because the births increased, but because they have found out that significantly fewer women have given birth to the same amount of children. The most extreme case is Moldova, where the 2014 census found that 700,000 fewer people live in the country than was previously estimated. The fertility rate thus shot up from 1.2 to 1.8 between 2013 and 2014. To conclude, I would like to point out that differences between different levels of sub-replacement fertility can make a huge difference. At a total fertility rate above 1.6 children per woman, population decline is gradual. A country with a fertility rate of 1.8 will be 80% as large after a century of decline, whereas one with a total fertility rate of 1.3 might collapse to a mere quarter of its size by the end of the 21st century. So, while it might seem that spending a lot of time researching and describing why one country can stay in the 1.6 to 2 children per woman territory, while the other is at 1.3 is pointless, it really is not. It might very well make the difference between a country surviving and a country disintegrating. Another crucial term I would like to look into is the so-called demographic momentum and the impacts of the age structure on population growth in general. The best countries to showcase this are the East Asian ones, also because they have not experienced much immigration until recently. You can notice that quite a lot of time can pass between the year in which the fertility rate of some country goes sub-replacement and the year in which its population starts to decline naturally. In the case of Japan, the fertility went sub-replacement in 1974, but the population began to decline in 2005. Japan experienced 30 years of population growth while having sub-replacement fertility. In South Korea, the fertility went sub-replacement in 1983, and the population started to decline in 2020, so it took almost 4 decades. The reason for this is the so-called demographic momentum, which is the tendency for growing populations to continue growing after a fertility decline because of their young age distribution. In the 1970s, the median age of the Japanese population was just over 30 years, similar to Israel today. The post-World War II baby boom generations were just in their 20s, and people over 65 comprised just 8% of the Japanese population. Additionally, the life expectancy in Japan was 74 years at the time, while today it is 84. In South Korea, the stats are even more extreme. In 1983, the median age was around 20, similar to African countries today. The share of people older than 65 was just 4%, and the life expectancy was merely 68 years, while it is 83 today. If your population structure is so young, you have a massive portion of your population at reproductive age. Thus, even though the average woman has low fertility, there are just so many women of childbearing age that the population will still grow. Moreover, suppose you simultaneously experience a massive increase in your life expectancy, 10 years in the case of Japan and 15 years in the case of South Korea. In that case, this is further enhanced by the older people accumulating in the old age brackets for a very long time. That means that while the South Korean population was naturally growing up to 2019, it was nevertheless already the country with the worst demographics in the world. The population collapse that would come was already inevitable, baked into the age structure. It was just postponed. Another phenomenon connected to this is the so-called demographic dividend. Most of you might be familiar with the term old age dependency ratio. It is defined as the number of individuals aged 65 and over per 100 people of the working age, defined as those between 20 and 64. But there is also the young age dependency ratio, which is the number of children aged 0 to 14 per 100 persons aged 15 to 64. Together, these two statistics make up the country's overall dependency ratio. Before a country gets entirely bogged down in the problems of aging and population decline, it usually goes through a period of the so-called demographic dividend, when its youthful population rapidly diminishes, and the elderly population is also relatively low, since the population has not yet grown old. That usually leads to a population in the productive age peaking at about 70% of the total population for a brief period before it starts to terminally decline. The whole period may last for a couple of decades and is usually economically very successful, since a vast majority of the population works, earns, consumes, and the state coffers flourish. For some of the oldest countries on the planet, like Japan, Germany or Italy, the peak happened in the late 1980s or early 1990s. For some of the countries whose fertility declined later, like Poland, South Korea or Thailand, the peak came in the past decade or so. But it is always temporary, and it precedes the fall. So, always look at the age structure. That is why the age pyramid is such an incredibly useful tool. One glance at it can tell you more about a country than any other visual or statistical tool, at least in my opinion. The last term I would like to analyze is the so-called demographic transition. Now, I have explained this term in several separate videos, but since it is one of the central concepts of modern demographics, it certainly deserves further exploration. The demographic transition is a theory that explains the unprecedented population boom that happened in the past 200 years, all over the planet. For the majority of history, human population reproductive behavior was defined by high birth rates and high death rates. Death rates were high for a bunch of reasons, especially disease, malnutrition, and deaths during childbirth. Infant mortality rates were absolutely crushing for the vast majority of human history. Human childbirth and early infanthood are incredibly dangerous in comparison with most other species on this planet, and the infant mortality rates were massive before the rapid scientific progress during the Industrial Revolution brought significant improvement in this regard. To put this in some numerical perspective, it is estimated that in the 18th century, 40 to 50% of children died during childhood in European countries like Sweden, France, or Germany. During the 19th century, around 150 out of every 1,000 children died either during or not long after birth in England and Wales. Remember that England was basically the most developed part of the planet at that point. Everywhere else, the figures were even higher. Infant mortality rate today in Niger, maybe the most underdeveloped country on the planet, is 60 per 1,000 live births, much lower than in 19th century Britain. Because of these massive mortality rates, both for infants and for adults, population growth was very, very slow for the vast majority of human history, and there were often massive setbacks caused by plagues, famines, and wars, the so-called Malthusian trap. It is estimated that during the time of Christ, there might have been circa 300 million people on Earth. In 1700, it is estimated that around 600 million people lived on the planet, with the average growth in these 1700 years between being estimated at 0.0%, which is very slow indeed. But then, the population growth absolutely skyrocketed, and the population of the planet reached 1 billion around 1800, 2 billion in 1928, 5 billion in 1987, and 8 billion a couple of years ago. The Malthusian cycle was shattered. What happened? Well, as I already alluded to before, people just started to die a lot less, both as infants and as adults. If you take the naturally high birth rates of people in pre-modern conditions and free them from the shackles of crushing mortality rates for a couple of generations, the population tends to grow exponentially. The first regions that experienced this exponential growth were usually those that began to industrialize first, since the technological progress connected to industrialization brought the conditions that led to decreased mortality rates. It began in England, which managed to quadruple its population during the 19th century, while also exporting millions of people to settler societies overseas. It then spread through continental Europe, North America, Japan, and gradually across the planet. However, the rapid growth phase is only the first part of the whole process. After some time, the fertility rates and the population growth start to decline. Populations urbanize and secularize, and children stop being free farm labor and start being a significant expense. As people get used to the fact that most of their offspring will survive to reproduce themselves and their bloodline is thus secured, they slowly shift from having as many of them as possible to having fewer, and instead start to funnel resources to their development and education. Very often, the country that managed to combine the rapid population growth phase of its demographic transition with industrialization and overall socio-economic development achieved a great power status and was seen by the other countries as a major threat. Just as the population growth was beginning to slow down in England, Germany was growing massively and its geopolitical position was rising. Just as Germany started to slow down, the population of Russia was still booming, and Russia then became the major world power for most of the 20th century. In the second half of the 20th century, this synergy of industrialization and population boom happened in China, which is now one of the two most powerful states on the planet. But sooner or later, the fertility rates and population growth declined almost everywhere, often to sub-replacement levels under 2.1 children per woman. Many countries are now facing population collapse of a similar magnitude as the population growth of the previous centuries. Today, basically only sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East or South and Central Asia are still in the high growth phase of the demographic transition, and fertility rates are declining everywhere. The demographic transition describes this process, going from high birth rates, high death rates, and very slow population growth, through a phase of high birth rates and lower death rates and rapid growth, to the final stage of low birth rates and population stagnation or decline. Now, there are a couple of facts that are important to remember about the demographic transition. First, it is a social science theory, not a natural law like the law of gravity or something like that. So, while the general rule applies to the vast majority of countries on the planet, there are some exceptions and additional factors influencing the process. Country-specific cultural and economic factors influence the pace and the scope of demographic transition, and the final level at which fertility rates stabilize. Some countries are able to stabilize at levels between 1.6 and 2 children per woman. Some fall as low as under 1 child per woman. That will hugely influence the magnitude of the coming collapse. For example, France did not undergo the high growth phase to the same extent as other comparable countries back in the 19th century. Israel seems to be able to defy the final decline of fertility rates to sub-replacement levels, even though its socio-economic development would suggest so, mostly for cultural reasons. If a country manages to rapidly modernize during its demographic transition, the fall of fertility rate from very high to ultra low can be incredibly fast, as in the case of China or South Korea, which saw their fertility rates decline from 6 to 1 in less than 50 years. These countries have experienced incredible population growth, which will be followed by incredible population decline in a very short time span, which will look like a sinusoid on a population graph. The countries that started their population transition earliest, like Northwestern Europe, usually managed to have a relatively modest impact on the overall demographics of the world in purely numerical numbers, since the mortality rates were still very high, even in comparison with the most underdeveloped places on the planet today. European countries thus usually increased their population 3 to 5 times before the fertility rates went sub-replacement. The upside for them is that the decline in fertility rates from very high levels of around 6 or 5 children per woman to the sub-replacement level happened gradually, usually over at least a century. However, there are countries that combine two traits. They managed to start their demographic transition late, generally due to being underdeveloped. That means that their relative demographic growth is very high, since, as I repeatedly mentioned, the scientific progress in healthcare and sanitation lowered the mortality rates in most underdeveloped parts of the planet to significantly lower levels than in 19th or 18th century Europe. But these countries have usually not undergone a rapid social modernization that would lead to their fertility rates declining rapidly, as in the case of East Asian countries, for example. They are declining, but relatively gradually. That means many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, or Afghanistan for example, might see their population increase 20 times before completing their demographic transition. Also because of the huge power of the demographic momentum I explained in the previous period. As the history of the world was shaped by the incredible population growth of the previous centuries, its future will be, to a large extent, shaped by the coming population collapse.